cbnt.it. You can find the blog and the podcast. A little bit more about myself. Again, I'm the principal at thectoadvisor.com. Basically, I take industry news, I look at markets, I look at the big mergers that's happening in enterprise IT, I look at the technologies, how they impact the enterprise. Specifically, my content is around the hybrid enterprise, the hybrid infrastructure in which large companies and small companies are challenged with the onset of cloud computing. How does cloud computing impact your day-to-day operations, and what technologies and processes should you be engaged in and really looking at to make sure you make the transition to that, what we call that digital business, or performing that digital transformation. Career highlights. I started my career in the 1990s, so I cut my teeth on Novell NetWare and the like. Progressed through that to a program architect at Lockheed Martin, where I was over the housing and urban development, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, their IT infrastructure, for about 2 years as the chief architect of that program. Got a little bit burnt out from IT, took a sabbatical, so to speak, and spent 2 years as a management consultant with PwC. So when I'm talking about the business case of IT and DR, and I specifically worked in the DR practice of PwC, we had this conversation over and over again with executives. So I'm bringing some of that Big Four experience to this conversation. Again, from a content perspective, and whether find me online at CTO Advisor on Twitter, and then my more technical content, which I don't write as much, how do you virtualize within virtualization is an example topic, can be found at virtualizedgeek.com. That's still referenced quite a bit for those of you that have home labs, interested in VMware, vSphere, Hyper-V, those types of technologies. That content is still archived at virtualizedgeek.com. Again, you can find most of my most recent stuff at the 3 locations listed on the presentation. So let's put up a quick poll question. Brian, in the background, if you can put the poll question up. Is the following a business case or a use case? Use a cloud storage service to back up laptops to prevent data loss. That is, I think, the essence. Your understanding of this statement on whether it's a business case or a use case, I think, is critical to our conversation going forward. Where are you at in your understanding of the 2 different terms? While there may be overlap, they're not exactly the same. And in IT, we struggle with those 2 different, the difference between those 2 terms. While you guys are answering that, it's a few of you online so far, so we'll wait for the answers to roll in. But in the meantime, let's go over the agenda for today's conversation. We're going to talk about basic project portfolio management. This is a concept that's relatively new to some, and in other organizations, we might have a pure, strictly button-down system that we have a portfolio management, what's commonly referred to by the acronym PPM, a PPM system for documenting all the projects, comparing them to each other, maintaining statuses, to the, there's a list of projects that the director of IT or the CIO or CTO or in some organizations, CFO has on like a spreadsheet that he keeps track of. In some form or function, every organization has a PPM system, and we'll talk into a little bit of detail on that. Then we're going to talk about DR as it's a part of business continuality. I think this is a legitimate question to ask yourself, is are you kind of the horse pushing the cart, or are you the horse pulling the cart? Is technology driving the discussion around business continuality? And if you're on this podcast, you're on this webinar, my assumption is that It's the latter. You're a technologist. You see a business problem. You want to solve that business problem, and you're not quite sure how to address those concerns. Then we're going to get into the meat of the webinar or the presentation. Details required for building a DR business case. This is stuff as technologists we are very comfortable about. We know how to get the data around it, and we understand kind of the technology behind disaster recovery. Then we're going to talk about the key measurements from a business perspective. Who are we presenting to, and what do they value? So those key value measurements we're going to talk through in some detail, which will make the foundation of the business case. And then we're going to wrap it up by presenting the business case. Then don't drop off. At the end of the webinar, I have maybe about 4 appendix slides that you can take away from this webinar and use it as you walk through or you think through creating a business case for disaster recovery inside of your own organization. So, Brian, who's with Carbonite, can you present the results of our poll?
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like the winner is yes. So as in, is the following business case or use case? So using a cloud storage service to back up laptops to prevent data loss, and the majority of folks selected yes.
All right, great answer, guys. You guys and gals, you guys have a good handle on what's a business case versus a use case. Let's go on to our business continuity and disaster recovery conversation. So we see this meme of people, process, technology all over the place. It's a meme, and it's a meme for a good reason. When we talk about the business and what we're trying to bring as value in disaster recovery to the business, technology is a part of the solution. The other part of the solution is people and process. We can have the completely redundant system. We can replicate from one data center to a cloud data center, or from our data center to another standby data center, and the technology works flawlessly. But if there's a physical disaster within a building that houses all the people and processes to do the functional work of the business, and there's no plan to mitigate the risk of a disaster or some other event happening in which the business needs to continue operations, all of that technical work is for naught. There's not much point in having data centers and services, spare laptops, remote computing, VPN, and all these technologies readily available if there's no process and testing mechanism for people to actually use it and transact the functions of business. Plus, technology is not usually the only part of processes. There's a lot of things that happen outside of technology, such as third partner relationships. So let's say that you're a manufacturing company and you need to ship product from your manufacturing system or your manufacturing facilities to customers. There's the logistics that happens in between. We can outsource that logistics to someone like UPS. If a factory manager calls up UPS to schedule shipments, and that facility is down or whatever happens, or UPS is down and UPS no longer works, that has nothing to do with technology. So normally the conversation around disaster recovery is an offshoot of the larger business continuity conversation. Unfortunately, in practice, because you're on this webinar and you're learning to kind of, how do I make the business case for disaster recovery, not every business understands the value of a BC, business continuity plan. And you're kind of here to hopefully get some insight into how do you jumpstart that conversation. I think when you formalize the disaster recovery business case, you kind of expose some of those weak points in the BC plan, and hopefully, as IT becomes the jump off or kickoff for having that deeper conversation about around business continuality. So let's talk about project governance at first, that PPM. These This is a simple question. On the screen, I'm not sure how well it shows up on a webinar, but in the background, I have a forklift. If you're a manufacturing company, chances are your CEO, CFO, all the senior executives, they understand the business of manufacturing. They're not in the business of IT. So when you come to them and say, you know what, we need a disaster recovery plan, even for technology companies, that can be a hard sell. Whatever the dollar amount you come to them and say, it's really hard to comprehend. In their mind, we've done great jobs of offering remote access. At this point, we've outsourced to Office 365 for cloud email, or we've provided some type of web access to cloud email. We've started to erase the lines. We've erased the four walls of our data center, and we've abstracted IT services away from executives. So if they're sitting in a meeting, they don't have to dial up to anything. They don't have to even connect to VPN to check email. In that same executive meeting, they're talking to the general manager of the plant in North Carolina. And the general manager says, you know what, Sarah, the CEO, I need new forklifts. The forklifts are old, and they're breaking down, and they're impacting productivity. And this can be a very casual conversation. And Sarah, the CEO, would say, you know what? I came up through the ranks. I was once a general manager of a plant. I understand intrinsically what it means to have old forklifts. You know what? Project approved. We're done. Whereas in IT, if we come with that very same conversation and say, you know what? We're using a tape-based backup system that was designed to, at the max, restore 1.5 terabytes of storage within a day. And now we have over 60 terabytes of storage. And we couldn't possibly get the business back up and running in our 24-hour RTO that we had before. And the CEO would more than likely look at you with a blank face, and they'll say, okay, I don't understand that. Well, that's why we have PPMs, project portfolio management systems. Every organization, whether it's informal or formal, has a way of weighting and comparing projects between each other. There's a finite dollar for forklift upgrades versus IT infrastructure improvements. The purpose of this webinar is for you to understand how to make an argument so that the CEO can, or the CFO, or whoever controls the purse strings, can properly understand, okay, what's the value of this IT improvement over the value of this physical infrastructure in the case of a forklift improvement. So some critical details we need to formulate even before, as professionals looking at this from a business case perspective, what are some of the technical details we need to get underway? Well, first and foremost, remember the slide, people, process, technology. The technology means nothing if we don't understand the processes. So from an IT perspective, it's critical for us to understand the mission critical processes and the technologies that support them. If you pay employees through Concur, and paying employees is a very important part of the business, you want to ensure that the systems that pay employees are protected. If you're a manufacturing company and there's a manufacturing some type of ERP or MRP, enterprise resource planning system or manufacturing resource planning system that supports the manufacturing of products and there's no paper backup to that, that's another application that we've identified as mission critical. So if you don't have a formal business continuity program that's operated by the business, this is some analyst work that as a IT person, you need to go out and have conversations with the CFO, with the CMO, with the sales organization, with the lines of business, whether you're a manufacturing, consulting company, etc. The business leaders you need to have conversations with to understand their critical processes and how they interact with technology. So there's overlap in that second point. Obviously, we need to understand the business critical processes. What do we need to do to run our business? Normally that includes paying employees, paying vendors, invoicing our customers, and shipping product, whatever shipping product may look like. And if we're a regulated industry, reporting our status to the government. Those five key elements are more or less elements that we all have within our different enterprises, no matter our industry. Again, so we want to look at applications, systems, and data that needs to be supported that's mission critical to the business. This should be documented in some fashion. Some people call it a business criticality form. I think other acronyms I've seen in the industry is a BIA. So again, you need to understand the importance of technology to the business in this relationship. Then when we've come up with a solution, we need to understand the solution. We also need to understand the current state. What's our recovery time objective? From the time of a system failure or a disaster, how much time can the business tolerate? So again, this is not a technical question in itself. This is a people and process question. How much time can the business tolerate without having those mission critical systems to operate the business? Some businesses have workarounds where they can continue manufacturing. You know, they print out 2 or 3 days worth of orders and they can run their manufacturing facilities for 2 or 3 days without a system like SAP or Oracle. Some people can still pay payroll manually. Maybe one cycle there's a manual process for handwriting checks. And some businesses can't tolerate that amount of time. If you're a financial services company and there's a disaster and your customers cannot access your systems, every minute that the system is down, you're losing revenue or opportunity. So you need to understand what's the recovery time objective from a business perspective. And then there's the recovery point objective. How much data can your environment stand to you lose? And we're still talking about specifically, not every application, such as, you know what, security logs. If you're not in a regulated industry, if you lost a day's worth of security logs, it'd be inconvenient, but it wouldn't stop your business from running in most instances. Versus you're in a web-based business and there's orders, you know, you get 100 orders an hour, and if you lose any one of those orders, any one of those records, you couldn't easily recreate the record. This isn't a paper-based thing where someone called into a call center, wrote down the specifics of an order, and then later someone keyed them into a system. That can be recreated. What can't be recreated, if I go to a web portal, buy your product, and then that data is lost, that sale is kind of lost indefinitely. There's no way to back it up. We need to understand what the recovery point objective, how much data, whether it's transactional or batch, how much data can we afford to lose and still successfully support our business in case of a disaster. And then there's the cost of the technical solution. So obviously, this is a business case. And a huge portion of the business case is the cost of the solution. And we're going to delve into the concept of cost. We use the term cost kind of loosely. I would like to call this KPIs, key performance indicators, or measurements. This is the part of the business conversation that you're going to have with your finance officer or your director of IT, whoever controls the purse strings for making the business decision. There's three key measurements that we can roll this up into on how to justify disaster recovery as a new project within your organization. The first thing that we'll talk about will be risk. Usually in IT, especially when it comes to disaster recovery, DR, our fear is some type of event that will happen and that will put the business at risk. And all those things that I talked about as IT professionals, we intrinsically understand that. We understand what keeps us up at night sometimes is the idea that the backup solution or the disaster recovery solution that we have in place is not enough if there's a true disaster. We know we dread the idea of trying to recreate our infrastructure right after a DR event. It might take days, weeks, or months, planning on depending on our current architecture. We need to be able to quantify that as part of our DR business case. So we'll call that risk, and we'll talk through risk a little bit. Then there's regulatory issues. If you're in a regulated industry, some industries you just have to have DRs. It's part of the cost of doing business. And then we'll talk about the monetary return, which is that's a tough one. It's tough to say, okay, implementing DR will save money or make money, but there are opportunities if we already have a DR system and it's inadequate, or it's become prohibitively expensive based on our growth and our architecture, that there is a monetary return. So we'll talk about how do we measure each one of these things. So risk. What is the risk? What is it that keeps us up at night? Temporary or permanent stop in operations. We've talked about this kind of ad nauseum to this point. Basically, if there's an event in one of our data centers or one of our technology providers' facilities, can we continue as a going concern? Is kind of the management consultant parlance. If there was a major technology disruption, could we stay in business? We talked through, can we pay our vendors and employees in case of a DR? Can we ship our product? Can we accept cash? What is it specific to your business? This is when we go back. A big part of, I can give you guys templates. I can give you worksheets. I can give you all kind of fancy things. But this creating the business case basically boils down to the hard work of going and having the conversation with business users, saying, hey, if you didn't have access to our EMR application in the event of if you didn't have access to our EMR application in the event of a technical disaster, what would be the impact to billing customers and billing our patients? What does that mean to the cash flow of if you're in a hospital or some type of clinic? What does that mean to our cash flow? Or if there is an interruption in EMR, what does that mean to patient care? Can we, more importantly, continue to work towards the health of our patients? What's the risk? And most organizations have the ability to quantify risk. There's some measurement of how they quantify risk. That measurement could be anywhere from the pure emotion. So we talked through the forklift example, my favorite example to give when I'm talking about business case versus use case. When the plant manager in North Carolina goes to the CEO, Sarah, and says, Sarah, I need new forklifts, that automatically triggers a emotional response in Sarah's being. She probably went through a period where forklifts were down and it impacted the ability to ship product. That's like a very informal way of measuring risk. Other organizations have actually, on a whole other end of the spectrum, ways to put monetary value around how they quantify risk. So if an event would happen, that means that if our storage array went down, we would then our SAP system would be down. If our SAP system would be down, then that means $10 million a day in lost revenue. There's a formula that companies use, and it varies from company to company, to say, okay, what's the likelihood of that happening? What's the impact to the business? And then let's put some type of probability into that and spit out a number. That number is going to be probably less than $10 million. And then let's say that it's a quantitatively it's a $1 million risk. The business says, oh, it's $1 million risk. We can either accept that risk, or we can pay the $1 million for the mitigation, up to $1 million to mitigate that risk. That's where you want to step up and say, hey, I got the perfect solution for you. Here's a solution that reduces that risk. It would probably never be zero, but it reduces it from $1 million to $100,000, or from $1 million to $10,000, or whatever formula that your company uses. Most companies, again, this is an emotional thing. So you have to quantify it in an emotional sense. You have to bring to light, look at whatever your equivalent is to the forklift. What is it that when you see those projects that in your mind consistently get approved, but you look at it and like, from a risk perspective, yeah, I understand that the forklifts are bad, but if the forklifts go down, maybe it's impeded productivity, but it's not stopped productivity. If SAP goes down, there is no business. And you need to be able to make that argument. And that is having your organization, not enough time in a day to go through talking through each individual use case. It's about having the conversation internally about how your organization quantifies risk. So regulatory concerns. These are really easy. The great thing, if there is a great thing about working in a regulated industry, that you get intrinsic benefits of certain things. When an external auditor comes into your facility, audits your IT operations, and then spits out a report with findings, chances are DR or backup is going to be in those findings. So whether you're a PCI, HIPAA, SOX, FDA, which is Federal Drug Administration, each one of those industries and regulatory standards have standards about protecting data or backing up data or reporting. And these reports that come back from the auditors are powerful, powerful tools. They go all the way up to the CEO, CFO, and board of directors. Normally, there's a board member who sits on the board who only responsibility is regulatory, making sure that, or compliance, and making sure that the company is in compliance. So when an audit finding comes back from an external and internal auditor, and you guys may be used to these hoops of saying, oh my goodness, and instead of doing interesting, cool work, I have to respond to these audit findings. This is where we use the power of the audit findings to get work done, to get investments made. Some basic questions that you can, or basic points you can make during a presentation or a business case file is understanding what are the penalties and fines if the audit finding is realized. So if an auditor comes in and says, you know what, your WAN link isn't sufficient for the amount of replication that needs to occur to keep backup in sync, you have to ask yourself, okay, what's the what's the again, going back to risk a little bit, what's the probability of this being realized? And if it's realized, what's the issue to the business? Will we experience penalties and fines because we didn't remediate the audit to begin with, the audit finding to begin with? If we have a DR event and we're found to have not been in line or in tune with our audit findings, we weren't responsive to those audit findings, what does that mean to the company? The company might not go out of business. We might still be able to we might not have been able to make the argument based on that previous risk-based slide. But if we had a DR event and the FDA came after us because we didn't have a formulation backed up into a remote data center or a remote cloud facility, what penalty or fine will the company face as a result? What's the loss of reputation? What's the value of the loss of reputation to our customers or our employees? Let's not underestimate that. If you can't get paid one billing cycle, you're probably going to look for a new job. Like, what kind of Mickey Mouse organization, even Disney, the Mickey Mouse organization, has a method for paying employees in the event of some type of failure? And then, is there a halt to regulations? Can a regulator come in and say, hey, for the past 2 audits, you haven't remediated this issue? You guys have to stop. A wild example. Let's say you're in food services and DR or whatever technology you're trying to get approved is essential to the health and safety of the food that you prepare. The health department can come in and say, hey, you know what? These findings over the past 2 or the past 2 audits, you guys just haven't remediated it. You're out of business until you remediate it. Is the issue that we're trying to champion from a technology perspective, in this case DR, serious enough that regulators can come and shut down the business? These become slam dunks for justifying disaster recovery investment. So the last point and these measurements that we want to go over, monetary return. The extreme example that I gave you, and this is not untrue. Will a refresh save money? One of the pushes for cloud computing in general is the ability to streamline CapEx investment. If you have some type of step or static investment that says, you know what, when we were backing up 1.5 terabytes of disk space, disk to disk made sense, or from a DR perspective, the link that the connection that we had to our backup facility that charged based on the amount of data that we replicated, that made sense. But now that we're at 50 terabytes of disk space, that model no longer makes sense. From a financial perspective, it's now cost prohibitive to have DR. What was a perfectly fine DR solution 5, 6, 7 years ago, today is completely cost prohibitive. It could have been, when AWS first came online, you had a small data set and you started to back that data up to AWS. And then you realized, oh, if I have a DR event and I need to retrieve that data, it can cost me literally millions of dollars to retrieve all that data. When it was only a half of terabyte, oh yeah, no big deal. But now that it's down to this 50 terabytes, sure, technically I can meet the RTO, but it's going to cost the company a boatload of money. Let me look at this other solution that saves the company money. That again is a slam dunk type of investment. So from an investment perspective, this is again getting into the financial weeds. How is the return measured? So even in our example of if we need to enact a DR and there's millions of dollars in cost going to our cloud provider to restore the data versus what we looked at a couple of years ago, is that cost something, how do we measure that in our organization? Is that cost avoidance? Is that going to be a return on investment? Because the way that you guys in your team measure risk is that we've placed a value on that $5 million, and that $5 million might be operationally a $200,000 hit every year to the budget. So we've kind of mitigated that through cost. Or is there like a true ROI? Is there a monthly cost associated with storing our data or having our backup solution at a traditional colo? There's a monthly cost associated to that versus going to some type of on-demand solution, which avoids cost and reduces the overall cost. And over a period of 5 months, the company would have recouped their investment of doing the migration. Return on investment. There's the OPEX versus CAPEX conversation. Again, there's this trend that companies want to move capital investment, meaning, the amount of money that they spend on equipment, uh, uh, basically equipment and IT, the money that they spend on servers, storage, hardware. The current DR solution is completely self-hosted, meaning that every time we have an upgrade, we have this depreciation cost that we have to carry for the next 5 years, versus this cloud OPEX model, in which, is it cheaper? No, but from a expense category, it's no longer CAPEX, it's OPEX, and as opposed to having a depreciable cost, we have a operational or expense cost that, from an accounting perspective, investors just like to see operational costs versus depreciation costs, which are fixed. And the perception is you can't easily reduce depreciation. Expense and operational, in theory, you know what? It's just a matter of terminating the contract. And from a financial risk perspective, OPEX is sometimes looked upon as a better model. And then in some organizations, they might want depreciation versus operations. Maybe there's hidden costs and operational expenses. Having employees, whereas a CAPEX, there's a fixed depreciation cost over a period of time. This is really finance geek stuff. It might be over your head, might be frustrating to hear. The bottom line as we go through the next couple of examples is you need to have the conversation with your finance people. When you prepare your business case and you get to that cost portion of it, or the template or the outline that I'll give you at the end of the webinar, you have to ask yourself, how does my organization measure return on an investment? It could be one or more of these methods. Two really deep in the weed methods is net present value, the present value of money versus the future value of money. So if I spent, the concept is the cost today is cheaper than the cost tomorrow due to inflation. Internal rate of return. This is going back to the PPM, project portfolio management. When you're comparing what seems like two dissimilar projects, a internal rate of return, basically, how much money will what's the rate at which this project will make money or return value to the business? Some businesses have a set rate that every project we have has to have a rate of return of at least, let's say, 3%. The ideal is that your project will beat that minimum amount, and then they can compare, the finance people can compare that amount to other projects. Going back to our forklift example, you can even challenge that. You can say, you know what, Sarah, you've indiscriminately just said, okay, the forklift project is a goal versus the DR project, which I believe has a better internal rate of return. Give me the opportunity to argue. Ask the plant operator in North Carolina to do internal rate of return analysis on his project, I'll do one on mine, and whichever has the better return, that's the project that wins. That's how portfolio project management is done at many organizations. Which project has the best rate of return for the business? Maybe that's oversimplifying it. There's other factors such as, is it aligned with the goals of the business, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, from a pure finance perspective, these are things you want to consider. And the biggest takeaway I want you to get from this slide is to go to your finance people and understand how are projects measured when it comes to the project's monetary return to the business. Do you have a system for measuring the return for IT projects? If so, how do you align your business case, the financial part of your business case, to that methodology that you use internally? And if there isn't one, then you find out, you poke for those soft things. You find out, hey, when Sarah got presented to her the forklift project, what were the key elements of that project from the financial piece that stood out to Sarah, the decision maker? And you want to make sure you copy that, or copy the attributes of it or the values of that into your presentation for your DR solution. Hopefully, I haven't bored you guys with too much of the financial risk and regulatory stuff, but this is kind of the deep innards of getting a business plan or a business case done. When you want to convey the importance to the business, you need to either sell it on risk, you need to sell it on regulatory/legal obligations, or you want to sell it on some type of return of value in the form of cash. And cash has so many different ways of measuring how it's met, and the other two as well, within each organization. What I want you guys to get from this presentation, above, again, everything else, is that if you want to get your DR project approved, the dirty work is in having conversations with the business, helping the business understand the risk that they're at, helping the business understand the value of the systems that they use. And an offshoot from this may be that not only do you get additional attention or resources to fix the DR problem, you actually may get additional attention or resources to fix performance issues or reliability issues you're having with systems that are in the business. You get to understand what the true pain points of the business is, and the business understands the value that IT brings, especially from a disaster recovery perspective. So as we're going into the home stretch of the presentation, let's talk a little bit about some logistics around presenting your business case. We've gone through all of the work of learning the business, learning how do we create a argument for the business case. Let's talk about some practicals when it comes to presenting the case. The most important thing is you need to know your audience. Know the environment. Is it a casual conversation that we can just we can walk into the president's office and sit down and, pull out a sheet of paper with these thoughts on, or have these thoughts kind of rattling in our head, and have a casual conversation with the president of the business? You're in a really small, informal audience. To the extreme, there's a project portfolio system that there's this whole SharePoint and CBT dedicated to how to use and submit projects to the system, and there's a whole committee that goes through and reviews each projects. To some kind of in betweens, that informal conversation to that super formal project portfolio management system with a committee. Do I write a post-it and leave it on my manager's desk, say, hey, let's have a conversation, to a well-worded email? We've captured all of these elements. We've made the argument, and we can send the argument to our CFO or CIO or CTO in an email, and that's enough to get done. One thing that I haven't spent any time to talking about, other than a casual mention to aligning yourself with the business goals. Every year you get down these goals that, from a HR perspective, that your manager's manager receives or created, and he's pushed down to everyone in the organization. A simple thing to do is make sure that you tie your business case to those goals. Those goals are there for a reason. Especially if it's a low-hanging fruit DR project, and you're like, okay, uh, I can easily execute upon this. That's a feather in your cap. If you can go to your manager and say, hey, these goals that you put down for me today, let me talk to you about how DR fits into meeting that goal. The bigger thing is DR is sometimes a footnote or a rounding error on some technology projects, IT infrastructure in general. You know what? Software licensing, professional services for application development, that eats up the majority of IT budgets when it comes to new projects. When you're looking at a new project, let's say it's a rollout of SAP, your organization, something huge, your organization is rolling out SAP. You want to jump on that as soon as possible and say, hey, if we're going to roll out SAP, a requirement for us supporting SAP is to upgrade DR. So SAP might be a $12 million project. DR might be a $250,000 rounding error. You want to make sure you get that. It's a lot easier to get that $250,000 as part of that SAP project, as a bolt-on or part of their budget in that project, than it is to take that $250,000 project, make it a $200,000 project, and go to your business and try and convince them to spend $200,000 on something that they don't see. Again, it's about relativity when it comes to business cases. If you're making the business case as part of a larger project, with a lack of a better term, it's easier. Well, let's use a business term. You can use the synergies of the larger project to get your smaller project approved and done. So that's the formal part of the course. I'm going to go into the appendix and talk a little bit about the outline for the elements that we created, and something that you can go and use as you're researching how your organizations do business cases. Just whether you take this as the next 3 or 4 slides as, I'm just going to take the headlines Keith used, put them into a deck, put the information into a deck and go present this, or just as an outline to say, I'm going to use these elements to create a detailed 18-page Word document that makes the argument. These are the basic elements of a business case from a presentation perspective. You want to make sure that you have your current state well documented. You can think of this as your business problem or your technical problem. What problem? What is the current state? Why is it bad? Why should we fix it? Some thoughts around how we leverage a business case to do that. A good place to place the RTO, RPO for your current state is in this present thing. This is one of the things I think is the most effective way to scare executives, to say that if there was a DR event such as X, if our data center was to burn, our RTO, our recovery time of objective, might be 3 months, or the RPO, recovery point objective, we will lose a 1 week of data because backups are stored in the same facility that we process data, or whatever that scary number. The most effective part of this current state is going to be that RTO, RPO from a risk perspective, or whatever that regulatory or monetary issue is. You want your money number, whatever that is, whether it's risk, regulatory, or financial, you want that on that first current state slide. The proposed state. How are we going to fix the problem? Because no one likes someone who just brings a problem without a solution. So you're going to have to invest some time and some resources in making sure that you've defined the solution, whether it's just a high level ROM numbers where you know roughly what it's going to cost or roughly the effort that it's going to take. You need to come through and have a solution to the problem. With the forklifts, the woman from the plant in North Carolina came to Sarah with a number saying, Sarah, I need forklifts, and this is what it's going to cost, and this is what it's going to do for us. You need to have those, you need to have a solution. It's a little bit tougher in IT because we have to do some engineering, but we want to have an idea of what the solution is and what the cost and benefit of that solution is. So the current state, which defines the problem, the proposed state, which goes into some high-level detail of how we're going to solve the problem and the benefits of that. Then that, what we generically call cost slide. And it's not just generic. This is real stuff. How much is it going to cost from an OPEX, CAPEX, a one-time versus recurring cost? What's the benefit? Again, we want to go if there's some formal process that your organization uses to compare projects. This is that slide or portion of your presentation that you want to make sure you go into some detail as to what are the detailed costs of the solution from both a expenditure perspective and a ROI if there's an ROI to the project. And lastly, we didn't talk about this from a DR project in itself, running the project. Whenever you present to an executive, no matter what it is, if you're presenting an idea to an executive, you're going to look like a much more finished product if you come with associated risks to the project itself. I don't mean the risk of what happens if we don't do the project. A lot of times I'll see IT professionals come up with this risk slide and say, you know what, if we don't do the project, these 1 of 4 or 5, 6 things may happen to the business. Well, you know what, we've already established that in the current state. What we're doing is that we're being transparent with the business line managers and saying, even if we undertake this project, here are some risks that associated to the execution of the project. For example, installing new replication may result in performance and WAN issues. So if we're presenting that, you know what, we need to replicate to another site or we need to replicate to the cloud, we're going to increase the load on our existing internet or WAN circuits. What does that mean to the business? Well, it means that there may be performance issues associated with our business applications. Well, again, we don't come to executive with just a problem. We always should have a mitigation to any risk that we associate with them. In my example, I only have one mitigation. We can have multiple mitigations. And this mitigation is upgrade the WAN link to 1.5 times the expected traffic flow. A second mitigation may be to put quality of service quality of service on the WAN links. Go on and on, but you want to make sure you quantify a solution to any risk that you bring up. And then from a severity perspective, you want to measure the likelihood and the probability of the risk. So what's the probability that will happen mixed with some factor of what's the impact of the risk. So if this was to happen during month end, it would slow month end down, but it wouldn't necessarily prevent month end from happening. So this is a medium to low severity, not that big of a deal. The business can decide if they want to upgrade the WAN link or apply quality of service, whatever your mitigation is. And then I provided a second example. That's it for the formal presentation. I think I've left, I like to talk, but I think I've left a couple of minutes for questions. Do we have questions in the audience? I'll open up for questions. You can go ahead.
And Keith, if anyone that wants to ask questions, they can just use the chat feature, and we can view those within the question section of GoToWebinar. Looks like one of the generic questions was just related to the slides. Was if the slides themselves were going to be made available.
And Brian, I will most definitely forward the slides on to you, and they are they you can use them as you choose. This is hopefully a tool for you to make a business case.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll include that in the recording. If anybody else has any other questions, yeah, just use the question feature and go to webinar. Here you go, Keith. Can you see that section under questions? Looks like a few have started popping through here.
Okay, let me. I don't see them.
Sure. I can just read this one aloud for you. It's there was a few that were related to the recording and the slides, but one of the questions here is, do you have a successful risk definition?
That's all over the place. There is no successful. That is based on organization. If your organization doesn't have one, I would say that you can go out, Google a risk, like the definition of risk. So there's risk and how to measure risk. So risk is stating what the problem is. It's a statement that says what the problem is and what will happen if the risk is realized. So in the first example that I have, there's two parts of it. There's installing new replication. So that's may result in performance issues. So the action is installing new replication, and what will happen as a result of it may result in performance issues. So two components: what may happen and what will happen if the action, and what will happen if that action is realized. And then the second one is restoring legacy backups and this should be may not be possible due to incompatibility with solution. So what is the potential outcome of the action that we're presenting? So restoring backups may not be possible and will result in something else. So what's the action and the result? You want to make sure there's always those two components. What I see a lot of times with people with unsuccessful risk statements is they'll say something to the effect is backups will fail. Okay, backups will fail if what? Another one is replication is slow. Okay, that's why is replication so slow? So you want to make sure you're able to provide that. And then obviously the mitigation is a potential solution that the company can go and do. And usually you can have some type of value to that. So upgrade the WAN links to accommodate 1.5 times the expected traffic. I can go out and get quotes for what it would cost to upgrade the WAN links to accommodate 1.5% of the traffic. So that's a risk. Versus an issue is a realized risk, meaning installing new replication may result in performance issues. 2 weeks down the road, we've installed the new replication and we're having performance issues. That's no longer a risk. That is a issue that you're actively solving. A risk is something that may happen based on some circumstance. So you want to define that in your risk statement. And an issue is something that has already happened and we're dealing with. Good question.
Excellent. Yeah, and you know what? Yeah, that was a fantastic question. It looks like we're about pretty much at the end of today's allotted time. But what I'll say is, I'm going to send out the recording as well as the slides. And if you have additional questions, just feel free to reply to the email if something does pop up, and I can work directly with Keith, and I can, maybe we can go back and forth and get you an additional answer if there's something else you're looking for.
And you can always, I'm available on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
Advisor. If you have questions, hit me on Twitter, and I'll be more than happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, there you go. Actually, that's the best way. Then you cut out the middleman, go right to Keith himself. All right, Keith, is there anything else you would like to provide to anyone today, or do you want me to just wrap everything up?
Nope, that is it.
All right, fantastic. All right, everyone. Well, again, we'll be sending out the slides and the recording. So thanks to everybody who joined us. Keith, thank you for a really fantastic webinar. You were not kidding around. You are able to talk to this entire thing, and I was worried when I saw the slides, and you were like, nope, I got this. And you fantastic job. So thanks to everyone who joined us, and Keith, thanks again. And we'll talk to everybody later. Again, hit up Keith on Twitter if you have any additional questions. Have a great rest of the afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thanks a lot.